The wind whipped across the plains, carrying with it the scent of sagebrush and the promise of a long, hot day. Sarah squinted, her gaze fixed on the horizon. Dust devils danced in the distance, mirroring the turmoil in her heart. Since her parents had succumbed to a sudden fever the previous winter, the Double Bar S Ranch had been her responsibility. She was only 20, but the land was in her blood, and she would sooner die than let it fall into the wrong hands. Her hands, calloused but capable, tightened on the reins of her horse, Buck. The town of Redemption wasn't much, a dusty main street lined with a saloon, a general store, and a few scattered houses. But it was the heart of the county, and Sheriff Brody ruled it with an iron fist disguised in a velvet glove. To the townsfolk, Brody was a pillar of the community, a strong, dependable lawman who kept the peace. He had a handsome face, a charming smile, and a way of looking at a woman that could make her knees weak. But Sarah saw through the facade. She saw the calculating glint in his eyes, the way he subtly intimidated those who disagreed with him, and the hunger for power that simmered beneath his polished exterior. Sheriff Brody had been paying Sarah a lot of attention lately, showing up at the ranch with increasing frequency, ostensibly to check on her welfare. He would offer unsolicited advice on running the ranch, his tone always polite but laced with an underlying presumption that she, a mere woman, couldn't possibly manage on her own. At first, Sarah had tried to be polite, but his visits were becoming increasingly unwelcome. She knew what he wanted. It wasn't her, it was her land. The Double Bar S bordered his own spread, and owning it would make him the most powerful man in the county. Today, Sarah was riding into town to pick up supplies. She needed feed for the cattle and some new tools for the ranch hands. As she approached the outskirts of Redemption, she spotted Brody leaning against the porch of the saloon. His eyes narrowed as he watched her approach. He straightened up as she drew closer, a practiced smile spreading across his face. "Sarah," he greeted her, his voice smooth as honey. "Out for a ride. Just getting supplies, Sheriff," she replied, keeping her tone neutral. "Mind if I walk with you?" he asked, falling into step beside her as she dismounted. Sarah sighed inwardly. This was exactly what she had been trying to avoid. "Suit yourself," she said, leading Buck towards the general store. She knew this wouldn't be a quick trip for supplies, not with Brody around. Inside the general store, the air was thick with the smell of leather, coffee beans, and something vaguely medicinal. Mr. Abernathy, the store owner, greeted Sarah with a nod and a knowing glance toward Brody, who leaned against a stack of flour sacks, watching her every move. "Mornin', Sarah. What can I get for you today?" Abernathy asked, his voice low. "Just the usual, Mr. Abernathy. Feed, some nails, and a new shovel head." As Abernathy gathered her supplies, Brody casually steered the conversation towards more personal matters. "The ranch must be keeping you busy, Sarah. It's a lot for a young woman to handle alone." Sarah bristled. "I'm managing just fine, Sheriff." "Oh, I don't doubt that," Brody chuckled, a sound that grated on Sarah's nerves. "But wouldn't it be easier to have a husband by your side? Someone to share the load, offer protection?" Sarah met his gaze, her eyes hardening. "I don't need protecting, Sheriff. And I certainly don't need a husband to run my ranch." Brody's smile didn't waver, but Sarah saw a flicker of annoyance in his eyes. "Now, Sarah, don't be hasty. I'm just looking out for your best interests. A woman needs a man, especially in these parts." He paused, letting his words sink in. "And the Double Bar S needs a strong hand to guide it." "I appreciate your concern," Sarah said, her voice tight, "but I'm perfectly capable of making my own decisions." She turned her attention to Mr. Abernathy, who was now loading her supplies onto a handcart. "Thank you, Mr. Abernathy. Put on my account, please." Outside, Brody continued his subtle campaign. He offered to help her load the supplies on a buck, his hand lingering a little too long on hers as he passed her the reins. "Think about what I said, Sarah. A partnership between us could be very beneficial. For both of us." "I have thought about it, Sheriff," Sarah replied, her voice firm. "And my answer is still no." She mounted Buck, her gaze unwavering. "Good day to you, Sheriff." As she rode away, Sarah could feel Brody's eyes on her back. She knew this wouldn't be the end of it. He was persistent, and he didn't take no for an answer easily. Each refusal only seemed to fuel his determination. She gripped the reins tighter, her mind racing. She needed a plan, something to protect herself and her ranch from Brody's relentless pursuit. She couldn't just keep saying no. She needed to find a way to make him stop permanently. The idea of leaving the Double Bar has crossed her mind, but she quickly dismissed it. She wouldn't let him run her off her land. This was her home, her legacy, and she would fight for it with every ounce of strength she possessed. The next few weeks were a living nightmare for Sarah. Brody's tactics escalated from subtle suggestions to blatant intimidation. He began harassing her ranch hands, citing minor infractions and levying exorbitant fines. He accused them of rustling, of public drunkenness, of disturbing the peace, all fabricated charges designed to bleed Sarah dry and demoralize her workforce. One evening, as Sarah was tending to a sick calf, Brody rode up to the ranch, his face grim. He dismounted and approached her, his voice devoid of its usual charm. "Sarah, I'm afraid I have some bad news." "What is it now, Sheriff?" Sarah asked, her voice weary. "We found some stolen cattle bearing your brand on Jedediah Smith's property. He claims your men have been rustling from him for months." Sarah's blood ran cold. Jedediah Smith was Brody's closest ally, a wealthy landowner who would do anything to please the sheriff. "That's a lie, Brody, and you know it. I have to follow the law, Sarah. I'm going to have to arrest your men." "You can't do that. They're innocent. Then you can prove it in court. But until then, they'll be held in custody. And I'm afraid I'll have to impound your cattle as evidence." Sarah knew this was a trap. Without her cattle and her ranch hands, the Double Bar S would be crippled. She looked at Brody, her eyes filled with anger and desperation. "What do you want, Brody? What will it take for you to leave us alone?" Brody's eyes gleamed with a predatory satisfaction. "There's only one way to make this all go away, Sarah. Marry me, become my wife, and I'll drop all the charges. Your men will be released, your cattle returned, and the Double Bar S will be safe." Sarah stared at him, her mind reeling. He was using his power to blackmail her, forcing her into a corner with no escape. Marriage to Brody was the last thing she wanted, but she couldn't let her ranch and her workers suffer. "You're a monster, Brody," she whispered, her voice trembling. "I'm just a man who knows what he wants, Sarah, and what I want is you and your land." He paused, letting his words hang in the air. "So, what's your answer?" Tears welled up in Sarah's eyes, but she refused to let them fall. She took a deep breath and looked Brody straight in the eye. "I'll marry you," she said, her voice barely audible. "But I'll never forgive you for this." Brody's smile returned, wider and more sinister than ever. "That's all I needed to hear, Sarah. Let's get the arrangements made." He mounted his horse, his eyes full of triumph. "We'll be married by week's end." As Brody rode away, Sarah sank to her knees, her heart filled with despair. She had sacrificed her freedom and her happiness to save her ranch, but she knew that this was just the beginning. She would never truly be Brody's wife. She would find a way to make him pay for what he had done, even if it was the last thing she ever did. A seed of resentment, dark and bitter, began to grow in her heart. She would not simply endure, she would retaliate. The wedding was a bleak affair, a stark contrast to the joyous celebrations Sarah had always imagined for herself. It was held in the town's dusty church, the air thick with the oppressive heat of the afternoon. Brody had insisted on a quick ceremony, eager to solidify his claim on Sarah and the Double Bar S. The townspeople, a mix of curiosity and pity in their eyes, filled the pews. Sarah suspected many of them knew the truth about Brody's coercion, but fear kept them silent. Sarah wore a simple, pale blue dress, chosen not for its beauty, but for its lack of adornment. It felt like a shroud, a symbol of a life she was burying. Her face was pale and drawn, her eyes devoid of emotion. She walked down the aisle, her steps heavy, her gaze fixed on the worn wooden floor. Brody stood at the altar, a smug smile on his face. He looked every inch the powerful, respected sheriff, but Sarah knew the darkness that lurked beneath the surface. The ceremony was brief and impersonal. The preacher, a nervous man who avoided Sarah's gaze, rushed through the vows. When it came time for Sarah to speak, her voice was barely a whisper. "I do," she managed to say, the words tasting like ash in her mouth. As Brody slipped the wedding ring onto her finger, his touch felt cold and possessive. He pulled her close for a perfunctory kiss, his lips brushing against hers without warmth or affection. Sarah recoiled inwardly, repulsed by his touch. After the ceremony, there was a small, awkward reception at the saloon. Sarah stood stiffly beside Brody, forcing a smile for the sake of appearances. She endured the well wishes and congratulations, each word a reminder of her forced servitude. The ranch hands, their faces etched with worry, offered their condolences. Sarah squeezed their hands, assuring them that she would be all right, though she knew it was a lie. As the sun began to set, Brody led Sarah back to the Double Bar S. He had already moved his belongings into her house, staking his claim on her territory. As she stood on the porch, watching him unpack, Sarah felt a surge of anger and resentment. This was her home, her sanctuary, and he had invaded it, defiled it. That night, as she lay in bed beside Brody, Sarah made a silent vow. She would not let him win. She would not let him control her life. She would find a way to turn the tables on him, to expose his true nature and reclaim her freedom. Revenge would be her constant companion, her guiding star. She would bide her time, observe his weaknesses, and wait for the perfect opportunity to strike. Brody may have forced her into this marriage, but he would soon learn that he had made a grave mistake. Sarah was not a woman to be trifled with. She was a survivor, and she would stop at nothing to get her life back. The wheels of her plan began to turn, slowly at first, but with a growing sense of purpose. She would make him pay dearly. The days that followed were a carefully orchestrated performance. Sarah played the part of a dutiful wife, attending to Brody's needs, cooking his meals, and even feigning affection in public. But beneath the surface, a storm was brewing. Every interaction, every conversation, was a calculated move in her elaborate game. She was studying him, learning his habits, his weaknesses, his secrets. She started by observing his daily routine. She noted the times he left the house, the routes he took, the people he met with. She learned that he had a fondness for whiskey, a weakness for gambling, and a particular disdain for anyone who questioned his authority. She discovered that he kept a locked strongbox in his office at the sheriff's station, and she made it her mission to find out what was inside. Sarah spent hours poring over old newspapers and law books, researching the most serious crimes in the territory. She needed a crime that would not only land Brody in prison, but also destroy his reputation beyond repair. Rustling wouldn't do, nor would a bar fight. It had to be something significant, something that would shock the community and turn them against him. She considered framing him for murder, but that was too risky. It would involve too many variables, too many opportunities for something to go wrong. She needed something cleaner, something more easily manipulated. That's when she started considering the stagecoach. One evening, while Brody was out at a poker game, Sarah snuck into his office at the sheriff's station. She knew he kept the key to the strongbox hidden in a small, ceramic owl on his desk. With trembling hands, she retrieved the key and unlocked the box. Inside, she found a collection of documents, including deeds to various properties, letters from shady characters, and a stack of cash. But what caught her eye was a ledger, filled with meticulously recorded entries of bribes and payoffs. This was it, the evidence she needed to ruin him. Sarah carefully copied the information from the ledger, making sure to note the names, dates, and amounts. She then returned the ledger to the strongbox, replaced the key, and slipped back into the house, her heart pounding in her chest. She now had the knowledge and the means to destroy Brody. All she needed was the opportunity, the right moment to put her plan into action. She would use his own corruption against him, turning his power into his downfall. The game was afoot, and Sarah was determined to win, no matter the cost. The long nights of meticulous planning had started to pay off. She had a foundation, and she was ready to build her house of cards, ready to watch it fall on Brody. The opportunity Sarah had been waiting for arrived with the thunder of hooves and the crack of gunfire. The stagecoach, carrying a shipment of gold from the mine, was robbed just outside of redemption. News of the robbery spread like wildfire, igniting fear and outrage throughout the town. Sarah knew this was her moment. Brody, as sheriff, immediately took charge of the investigation. He gathered a posse and rode out to the scene of the crime, his face grim and determined. Sarah, feigning concern, insisted on accompanying him, claiming she wanted to offer her support. In reality, she needed to be there to ensure her plan went off without a hitch. At the scene of the robbery, Sarah subtly began to manipulate the evidence. While Brody and his posse examined the stagecoach, she discreetly planted a small, silver-plated pocket watch near the overturned vehicle. It was a watch she had borrowed from Brody's belongings a few days prior, an expensive item he rarely used. Later, as the posse searched the surrounding area for clues, Sarah led them towards a narrow ravine. "Sheriff, look!" she exclaimed, pointing to a set of footprints in the muddy ground. "These look like they belong to the robbers." Brody examined the footprints, his brow furrowed. "They're heading towards the north," he said. "Let's follow them." As the posse tracked the footprints, Sarah lingered behind, carefully placing a torn piece of fabric from one of Brody's shirts on a nearby bush. The fabric was nearly identical in color and pattern to the shirt Brody had worn the day before, making it appear as though he had been involved in a struggle. Back in town, Sarah made sure to subtly steer the conversation towards Brody's possible involvement. She confided in Mrs. Abernathy, the general store owner's wife, expressing her concerns about Brody's recent behavior and his sudden need for money. "He's been acting so strange lately, Martha," she said, her voice laced with worry. "I'm afraid he might be in some kind of trouble." Sarah knew that Mrs. Abernathy was a notorious gossip, and it wouldn't be long before her suspicions reached the ears of the townspeople. She was carefully planting the seeds of doubt, preparing the ground for Brody's downfall. That evening, as Brody sat at his desk, reviewing the evidence from the robbery, Sarah approached him, her eyes filled with feigned concern. "How's the investigation going, Brody?" she asked, her voice soft. Brody sighed, rubbing his temples. "It's not looking good, Sarah. The robbers got away clean, and we don't have much to go on." "Maybe you're looking in the wrong places," Sarah said, her voice barely a whisper. She watched as a flicker of unease crossed his face. Her plan was working. The noose was tightening. Soon, Brody would be caught in her web of deceit, and there would be no escape. At first, the townspeople dismissed the whispers and rumors as mere gossip. Sheriff Brody had been a fixture in Redemption for years, a symbol of law and order. The idea that he could be involved in a crime, let alone a violent stagecoach robbery, seemed absurd. But as more evidence surfaced, planted meticulously by Sarah, doubts began to creep into their minds. The discovery of Brody's silver-plated pocket watch at the scene of the robbery was a turning point. The watch was well known in town, a gift from his late father. When news of its recovery spread, people started to question how it could have ended up there. Then came the torn piece of fabric. While not conclusive proof, it added another layer of suspicion. The shirt, which Brody had supposedly discarded due to a stain, was remarkably similar to the fabric found near the ravine. People began to notice that Brody seemed unusually preoccupied, avoiding eye contact and growing irritable. Sarah, meanwhile, continued to play the role of the concerned wife, subtly fueling the growing unease. She would confide in trusted friends, expressing her fears about Brody's financial problems and his increasingly erratic behavior. She portrayed herself as a victim, a woman torn between loyalty to her husband and her duty to the town. The town council, initially reluctant to interfere with the sheriff's investigation, found themselves under increasing pressure from the community. They held a closed-door meeting, debating whether to confront Brody with the mounting evidence. Mr. Abernathy, the general store owner, was one of the first to openly voice his concerns. "I've known Brody for years," he said, his voice troubled. "But I can't deny that things don't add up. The watch, the fabric, it's all too coincidental." Others echoed his sentiments, sharing their own observations and suspicions. The council members, realizing the gravity of the situation, decided they had no choice but to act. They appointed a small committee to investigate the matter further, promising a thorough and impartial inquiry. As the investigation intensified, the town became divided. Some remained steadfast in their support of Brody, refusing to believe he was capable of such a crime. Others, swayed by the mounting evidence and Sarah's subtle manipulations, began to see him in a new light. Brody, sensing the shift in public opinion, grew increasingly defensive. He lashed out at anyone who questioned him, further fueling the suspicion that he had something to hide. The more he protested his innocence, the more guilty he seemed. Sarah watched with a cold satisfaction as her plan unfolded. The town was turning against Brody, the evidence mounting against him. It was only a matter of time before the truth, or at least her carefully crafted version of it, was revealed. The foundation of her revenge had been laid, and the structure was rapidly taking shape. The day of reckoning was drawing near. The day Brody was arrested, a stunned silence fell over redemption. The town council, acting on the committee's findings, had no choice but to relieve him of his duties and take him into custody. The arrest was carried out in broad daylight, in front of the entire town. Brody, his face a mask of fury and disbelief, was led away in handcuffs. Throughout the ordeal, Sarah remained by his side, a picture of unwavering support. She held his hand as he was being arrested, her eyes filled with tears. She visited him in jail every day, bringing him food and words of encouragement. She hired a lawyer to defend him, publicly proclaiming his innocence and vowing to stand by him through thick and thin. But behind the scenes, Sarah was working tirelessly to ensure Brody's conviction. She met with the prosecutor, subtly guiding him towards the most damaging evidence. She provided him with details about Brody's past, his financial troubles, and his corrupt dealings, painting a picture of a man desperate enough to commit such a crime. She also reached out to potential witnesses, subtly influencing their testimony. She reminded them of Brody's past injustices, his abuse of power, and his mistreatment of others, reinforcing the idea that he was capable of anything. The trial was a spectacle, the biggest event in Redemption's history. The courtroom was packed every day, with townspeople eager to witness the downfall of their once respected sheriff. The prosecution presented a compelling case, highlighting the circumstantial evidence and portraying Brody as a greedy and unscrupulous man. Brody, in his defense, maintained his innocence, claiming he was being framed by his enemies. He accused Sarah of turning against him, driven by greed and ambition. But his words rang hollow, and his increasingly desperate pleas only served to reinforce the impression that he was guilty. Sarah, called to testify as a witness for the prosecution, delivered a masterful performance. She portrayed herself as a loving and devoted wife, betrayed by the man she had trusted. She spoke of Brody's sudden mood swings, his unexplained absences, and his suspicious behavior in the days leading up to the robbery. She painted a picture of a man consumed by greed, willing to do anything to get what he wanted. Her testimony was devastating, effectively sealing Brody's fate. The jury, swayed by her performance and the overwhelming evidence, deliberated for only a few hours before returning a guilty verdict. As the verdict was read, Sarah stood beside Brody, her face etched with sorrow. She squeezed his hand, offering him a final, fleeting moment of comfort. But inside, she felt a surge of triumph. Her plan had worked. Brody was going to prison, and she was finally free. The first act of her revenge was complete. But she knew that the play was not over yet. There were still more acts to perform. The trial was the hottest ticket in Redemption. Every seat in the courtroom was filled, the air thick with anticipation and the smell of sweat. Brody sat at the defendant's table, his face a mask of defiance, his eyes darting nervously around the room. Sarah sat in the gallery, her face pale but composed, a study in quiet sorrow. The prosecution presented a compelling case, calling witnesses who testified to Brody's financial difficulties, his gambling debts, and his increasingly erratic behavior. The torn piece of fabric and the silver pocket watch were presented as key pieces of evidence, linking Brody directly to the scene of the crime. Brody's defense attorney, a slick-talking lawyer from out of town, attempted to discredit the evidence, arguing that it was all circumstantial and that Brody was being framed by his enemies. But his efforts were largely ineffective, and the prosecution's case remained strong. Then came Sarah's turn to testify. She walked to the witness stand, her steps measured, her head held high. She took the oath, her voice clear and steady, and looked directly at the jury. The prosecutor began by asking her about her relationship with Brody, how they met, and how their marriage had unfolded. Sarah carefully crafted her answers, portraying herself as a loving and devoted wife who had been blindsided by her husband's betrayal. She spoke of the early days of their marriage, when she had believed Brody to be a good and honest man. She described how his behavior had changed in recent months, how he had become distant and secretive, how he had started staying out late and gambling away their money. "He wasn't the man I married," she said, her voice trembling with emotion. "I don't know what happened to him, but he changed. He became someone I didn't recognize." The prosecutor then asked her about the night of the stagecoach robbery. Sarah described how Brody had left the house early that morning, claiming he had to attend to some urgent business. She recounted how he had returned late that night, looking exhausted and agitated. "He wouldn't tell me where he had been," she said, her eyes filling with tears. "He just said he had been dealing with some trouble. I asked him if he was involved in the robbery, but he denied it. He swore he had nothing to do with it." Sarah paused, wiping away a tear with a delicate handkerchief. "I wanted to believe him," she said, her voice barely a whisper. "I wanted to trust him, but deep down, I knew something wasn't right." The prosecutor then presented the silver pocket watch, asking Sarah if she recognized it. Sarah nodded, her voice choked with emotion. "It was a gift from his father," she said. "He always carried it with him." The prosecutor then presented the torn piece of fabric, asking Sarah if she recognized it as well. Sarah hesitated for a moment, her face etched with pain. "It looks like a piece of one of Brody's shirts," she said. "He threw it away a few weeks ago because it had a stain on it." The prosecutor had no further questions. Brody's defense attorney cross-examined Sarah, attempting to discredit her testimony and expose her motives. But Sarah remained calm and composed, deflecting his questions with skillful precision. Her testimony was devastating. She had painted a picture of Brody as a man consumed by greed and desperation, a man capable of committing the crime he was accused of. She had played the part of the betrayed and heartbroken wife to perfection, swaying the jury with her emotion and her sincerity. As she stepped down from the witness stand, she looked directly at Brody, her eyes filled with a mixture of sorrow and defiance. She had done what she had to do. She had sealed his fate. The rest was up to the jury. The tension in the courtroom was palpable. Everyone knew that the verdict would determine not only Brody's fate, but also the future of redemption. The jury's verdict hung heavy in the air. "Guilty," the foreman announced, his voice echoing through the silent courtroom. A collective gasp swept through the crowd. Brody, his face ashen, stared blankly ahead, the reality of his situation crashing down upon him. Sarah, standing beside him, felt a strange mixture of emotions: relief, triumph, and a gnawing sense of unease. She had achieved her revenge. She had freed herself from Brody's clutches and reclaimed her life. But what cost? Brody was sentenced to 20 years in prison, a fate that seemed both just and excessively harsh. As he was led away, he turned to Sarah, his eyes filled with a bitter hatred. "You'll regret this, Sarah," he snarled. "You'll pay for what you've done." Sarah watched him go, her heart pounding in her chest. His words haunted her, echoing the doubts that had been swirling in her mind since the trial began. Had she gone too far? Had she allowed her thirst for revenge to cloud her judgment? In the days that followed, Sarah tried to resume her life at the Double Bar S. She threw herself into her work, tending to the cattle, mending fences, and managing the ranch hands. But she couldn't shake the feeling that something was wrong. The townspeople, once so supportive of her, now regarded her with a mixture of suspicion and resentment. They whispered behind her back, questioning her motives and accusing her of being a cold-blooded manipulator. Even her closest friends seemed distant, unsure of how to treat her. Sarah began to question her own actions. She had framed an innocent man, even if he was a corrupt and ruthless one. She had manipulated the evidence, influenced witnesses, and lied under oath. She had become the very thing she hated. She started having nightmares, vivid dreams of Brody's accusing eyes and the faces of the townspeople, their expressions filled with judgment. She couldn't sleep, couldn't eat, couldn't find peace. One evening, as she sat alone on the porch, watching the sunset, she realized that she hadn't truly won. She had freed herself from Brody's physical control, but she was still trapped by her own guilt and remorse. The revenge she had sought had come at a terrible price, leaving her with a hollow victory and a heavy heart. The Double Bar S felt empty and meaningless. She had fought so hard to protect her land, but now she wondered if it was worth it. She had sacrificed her integrity, her happiness, and her relationships for the sake of revenge. She knew she had to do something to set things right, to find a way to atone for her actions. But what could she do? How could she undo the damage she had caused? The answer eluded her, leaving her feeling lost and desperate. She achieved her revenge, but the victory felt like ashes in her mouth. The weight of her choices pressed down on her, heavier than any burden she had ever carried. She felt deeply conflicted about the consequences of what she had done. Just as Sarah was grappling with the weight of her guilt, a stranger rode into redemption, stirring up dust and long-buried secrets. His name was Caleb, and he claimed to be a Pinkerton detective sent to investigate a series of unsolved robberies in the territory. He was a tall, lean man with piercing blue eyes and a quiet demeanor that belied a sharp intellect. Caleb wasted no time in making his presence known. He visited the sheriff's station, reviewed the case files, and interviewed the townspeople, including Sarah. He listened intently to her story, his gaze unwavering, his expression unreadable. One afternoon, Caleb approached Sarah at the Double Bar S, his face grave. "Mrs. Brody," he said, "I need to ask you some questions about the stagecoach robbery." Sarah's heart skipped a beat. She had anticipated this moment, but she still felt a surge of anxiety. "I've already told the authorities everything I know," she said, her voice steady. "I understand," Caleb replied, "but I've uncovered some new evidence that suggests there may be more to the story than meets the eye." He paused, letting his words sink in. "I've learned that Brody wasn't the only one with a motive to rob that stagecoach." Caleb revealed that Jedediah Smith, the wealthy landowner and Brody's close ally, had been secretly struggling financially. He had been heavily in debt to a group of ruthless businessmen from out of state, and he desperately needed money to pay them off. Smith hired Brody to rob the stagecoach, Caleb said, but Brody double-crossed him, keeping the gold for himself. Smith was furious, but he couldn't expose Brody without revealing his own involvement. Caleb then presented Sarah with a letter he had found among Smith's belongings, a letter from the businessman threatening Smith's life if he didn't repay his debts. The letter implicated Smith directly in the stagecoach robbery, proving that Brody had been framed. But that wasn't all. Caleb also had information that Sarah had framed Brody, knowing of the corruption, but using the stagecoach robbery as a means to escape the marriage and take control of her life. Sarah was stunned. She had been so focused on framing Brody that she hadn't considered the possibility that someone else might have been involved. Now, the truth was out, and she had to decide what to do with it. Did she continue to let Brody take the fall for a crime he didn't commit? Or did she confess her own role in the deception and risk facing the consequences? The arrival of Caleb had thrown everything into chaos. Her carefully constructed world was crumbling around her, and she was faced with a difficult choice. The weight of her actions pressed down on her, heavier than ever before. The truth, like a wild card, had been dealt, and the game was about to change in ways she couldn't have imagined. The twist, it seemed, was not just Brody's innocence, but the exposure of her own frame-up. Caleb's revelations left Sarah reeling. She paced the floor of her ranch house, her mind racing, trying to make sense of the tangled web of deceit and betrayal. She was faced with an impossible choice, a moral dilemma that threatened to tear her apart. On one hand, she could maintain her deception, allowing Brody to remain in prison for a crime he didn't commit, at least not entirely. While Brody had been corrupt and had forced her into marriage, Caleb's evidence suggested he wasn't the mastermind behind the stagecoach robbery. Jedediah Smith was the true culprit, and Brody was merely a pawn in his scheme. By staying silent, she would be protecting herself from the consequences of her actions, preserving her reputation, and maintaining her newfound freedom. It would also mean Smith would likely get away with his crimes. On the other hand, she could confess her own role in framing Brody, revealing the truth about her carefully orchestrated plan and facing the potential consequences. She could be ostracized by the townspeople, lose her freedom, and even face imprisonment herself. But it would also mean freeing an innocent man, at least in regards to the stagecoach robbery, and atoning for her sins. It would be an act of redemption, a chance to reclaim her integrity and find peace of mind. The weight of her decision pressed down on her, heavier than ever before. She knew that whatever she chose, there would be consequences. There would be pain, suffering, and perhaps even death. She spent the night tossing and turning, haunted by nightmares of Brody's accusing eyes and the faces of the townspeople, their expressions filled with judgment. She wrestled with her conscience, struggling to reconcile her desire for revenge with her growing sense of guilt and remorse. As dawn broke, painting the sky with hues of orange and pink, Sarah made her decision. She knew that she couldn't live with the lie any longer. She had to confess, to tell the truth, no matter the cost. She saddled Buck and rode into town, her heart pounding in her chest. She found Caleb at the sheriff's station, reviewing the case files. "I need to talk to you," she said, her voice barely a whisper. "I have something to confess." Caleb looked at her, his expression unreadable. He knew that whatever she was about to say would change everything. Sarah took a deep breath and began to speak, her voice trembling but determined. She told Caleb everything, from Brody's forced marriage to her elaborate plan to frame him for the stagecoach robbery. She revealed her manipulations, her lies, and her deceit, holding nothing back. As she spoke, she felt a sense of relief wash over her, a burden lifting from her shoulders. But she also knew that her confession was just the beginning. The real consequences were yet to come. She had chosen to face the music, and now she had to prepare herself for the symphony of pain and suffering that was about to unfold. She had confessed, and the future was uncertain. Sarah's confession sent shockwaves through redemption. Caleb, after verifying her story with the available evidence, immediately arranged for Brody's release and Jedediah Smith's arrest. The townspeople, initially stunned, reacted with a mixture of outrage and disbelief. Some accused Sarah of being a liar and a manipulator, while others admired her courage in admitting her wrongdoing. News of Brody's impending release reached him in prison, igniting a furious rage. He had spent months stewing in his own bitterness, convinced that Sarah had betrayed him out of greed and ambition. Now he learned that he had been framed not just by Smith, but by the very woman he had wronged. Upon his release, Brody, consumed by vengeance, rode straight to the Double Bar S, determined to confront Sarah and make her pay for what she had done. He found her standing on the porch, waiting for him, her face pale but resolute. "You lied to me," Brody roared, his voice filled with fury. "You framed me. You ruined my life." "I know," Sarah said, her voice barely audible. "And I'm sorry." "Sorry isn't good enough," Brody shouted, his hand reaching for the gun at his hip. "You're going to pay for what you've done, Sarah." Just as Brody was about to draw his weapon, Caleb appeared, stepping between them, his gun drawn and aimed at Brody. "Sheriff Brody, I advise you to stand down," Caleb said, his voice calm but firm. "Any further violence will result in your immediate rearrest." Brody hesitated, his eyes darting between Sarah and Caleb. He knew that he couldn't win in a gunfight against a Pinkerton detective. But he couldn't let Sarah get away with what she had done. "This isn't over, Sarah," Brody snarled. "I'll make you pay for this, one way or another." Brody turned and stormed away, leaving Sarah standing on the porch, her heart pounding in her chest. She had faced her accuser, confessed her sins, and risked her life to tell the truth. But the confrontation had left her feeling more vulnerable and uncertain than ever before. The climax of this story is the confrontation with the townspeople. The townspeople wanted Brody back as sheriff. They were afraid of change. They didn't want a woman running the town. They had come to Sarah's ranch to let her know that she was no longer welcome in Redemption. The townspeople had torches and pitchforks. They looked angry and scared. Sarah stood on the porch, facing them, her head held high. She knew that she had done the right thing, even if it meant losing everything. The townspeople began to shout and throw rocks. Caleb stepped forward, trying to reason with them, but they wouldn't listen. They were too afraid, too angry. The climax of the story is the confrontation with the townspeople. Sarah knew that she had to leave Redemption. She couldn't stay there any longer. She had to find a new place to start over. The confrontation, whether with Brody or the townspeople, marks a turning point in Sarah's journey. She has confessed, faced her accusers, and risked everything for the truth. But what will become of her now? Will she find redemption, or will she be forever haunted by her past? The answer remains to be seen. Leaving redemption behind, Sarah rode west, the setting sun casting long shadows across the plains. She had lost everything, her home, her reputation, her friends. But she had also gained something, a chance to start over, to build a new life based on honesty and integrity. Jedediah Smith was brought to justice, his crimes exposed, and his wealth seized. The corrupt officials he had bribed were also removed from office, paving the way for a new era of law and order in the county. Brody, cleared of the stagecoach robbery but still tainted by his past corruption, found himself ostracized by the townspeople. He tried to reclaim his position as sheriff, but the town council refused, citing his abuse of power and his lack of integrity. He was left a broken man, haunted by his past mistakes and the knowledge that he had nearly destroyed an innocent woman. He disappeared from redemption, seeking a new life elsewhere. As for Sarah, she eventually settled in a small town nestled in the foothills of the Rocky Mountains. She found work as a schoolteacher, sharing her knowledge and wisdom with the children of the community. She kept her past a secret, fearing. Years passed. The dust settled in redemption, and the events surrounding the stagecoach robbery and Sheriff Brody faded into local legend. The story served as a stark reminder of the corrupting influence of power and the destructive nature of revenge. The Wild West, with its vast landscapes and untamed spirit, was a breeding ground for both justice and injustice. In a world where the lines between right and wrong were often blurred, individuals were forced to make difficult choices that could define their lives and shape their destinies. Sarah's story is a testament to the complexities of human nature. She was a strong and resourceful woman, driven by a desire for justice. But her thirst for revenge led her down a dark path, forcing her to confront her own inner demons and make a difficult choice between vengeance and redemption. In the end, Sarah chose the path of redemption. She confessed her sins, faced the consequences of her actions, and sought to build a new life based on honesty and integrity. She found peace in her work as a schoolteacher, sharing her knowledge and wisdom with the next generation. Did she ever fully escape the shadow of her past? Perhaps not, but she learned to live with her mistakes, to forgive herself, and to find meaning and purpose in her new life. She taught her students the importance of honesty, integrity, and compassion, hoping to instill in them the values that she had once abandoned. And what of Brody? Did he ever find redemption? That remains a mystery. Some say he wandered the West, a broken and bitter man, haunted by his past. Others say he eventually found peace and forgiveness, learning from his mistakes and seeking to make amends. His ultimate fate remains unknown, a reminder that the choices we make in life can have lasting consequences. Sarah's future remained bright. She continued to teach, impacting many young lives. She found love again, marrying a kind rancher who understood her past and accepted her for who she was. She never forgot redemption or the lessons she learned there. She often spoke of the importance of forgiveness and of choosing the path of light, even when surrounded by darkness. Her story became a local legend, a tale told around campfires, a reminder that even in the Wild West, where justice was often elusive, redemption was always possible. It was a story of revenge, justice, the corrupting influence of power, and ultimately, the enduring power of the human spirit to overcome adversity and find a path toward a better future. Her students would sit by the fire, listening intently to the stories, not knowing that the hero was the old woman with the kind eyes. And Sarah, looking at their faces, would know that her future was secure.